Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Offer, and I'll be presenting a PowerPoint on nonverbal interaction. To start this presentation, I'd like you to look at this photograph of college students in the 1950s. I'm guessing that you can figure out a lot about what college was like in the 1950s without interviewing these people, just by looking at the photograph. And what you'd be basing your opinions on and your guesses about what it was like is the way they're sitting, the desks, the way the desks are organized, what they're wearing, their haircuts, their makeup if they're wearing any, their the way the rows are set up, what you could see in the back of the room and on the side of the room. All of these things are aspects of nonverbal communication. They are expressing meaning. So to preview the rest of this presentation, I want you to know that what I'll be talking about is an exploration of nonverbal interaction. We will identify principles of nonverbal communication. We'll discuss the types of nonverbal behavior, and we'll look at guidelines for effective nonverbal behavior. Beginning with the functions. There are 5 functions of nonverbal communication. It allows us to establish our identities, express thoughts and feelings, reflect on ourselves, define and regulate our relationships, and create interaction climates. So I'd like you to take a look at this person who's giving a presentation here and think about some of these things. So his identity, right? You look at that suit, you look at how he's standing up in front of a poster, which may be using for the presentation, right? So it gives the impression he's a professional, he's a presenter, perhaps a business person, perhaps another kind of organization. You can tell from the way he's presenting that he knows what he's talking about. He looks confident. He's using his hands to illustrate. He has a pleasant expression on his face. And he looks really confident. So to reflect on ourselves, he looks really confident, right? So those are the first 3. Now I want to show you some more photographs of some of the other functions of nonverbal communication. This is the function of expressing identity. So there are a lot of different kinds of jobs that you can have, but each job has its own way where people are expressing their identity. So this person on the right that's in front of Google, who's a Google employee, that's a real different way of expressing your identity than the business person we saw in the last slide who's doing the presentation, right? So Google has a different culture, different way that the employees show up to work and are being their professional selves. Then we have doctors, and they're often wearing the kinds of clothes that they have to wear when they're examining patients or doing procedures, and then sometimes they're wearing suits at meetings, right? So this is different kind of work identities. You can see different work identities at school. Here, the teachers dress a little different than the students most of the time, not all the time, versus the administrators. The administrators are the ones you're going to see with suits and ties and more dressed up, right? Versus the people, the janitors and so on, right? We're all, the way that we look expresses our role. We can also dress and express ourselves non-verbally according to our avocations, which are the things that we love to do besides work, our hobbies and our passions. And so you here have a rock band, and they're dressed very differently than the people in the soccer team on the right who are just hanging out, right? So you can almost tell people's avocations by what they're wearing, right? And the way that they do their hair and their makeup and their tattoos or not tattoos or their other adornments like piercings and so on, right? So we can tell a lot about people, who they are and what they do, and how they think about themselves from the nonverbal communication, also their posture, their gestures, and so on. Then here we have the expression of feelings, right? So a lot of times we look to the face. So we see a person smiling on the left. She looks very happy. We see a person looking very sad on the right. And part of the reason he looks sad is not only because his lips are going down and it's almost a frowny expression, but look at his the wrinkles on his forehead. He looks like he's in deep sadness and perhaps loss. And look at the way he's sitting. He's kind of slumped, right? So all of this aspects of his posture and his facial expressions and so on tell us about feelings. Next, we're looking at self-reflections and how they're expressed. Okay, so this first speaker on the left, he's really nervous, right? So he's reflecting on himself as not being a good speaker, and it's showing in his body language, right? He's slumped over and leaning, and instead of standing up like he's confident, and the way he's staring ahead, and the way his forehead is all wrinkled, like he's really worried. Okay, so this is all nonverbal, a self-reflection of him not feeling confident about being a public speaker versus the woman on the right who is super confident at a job interview, and she's thinking positive thoughts about herself, like I'm awesome. So you can see that also in her body language. You can see she has erect posture, and the way she has her hands just settled, relaxed in front of her. Her face looks very relaxed. She's looking straight on to the interviewer with a pleasant expression on her face. So all of that tells the interviewer, hey, she's confident. She knows what she's talking about. Next, we have a little bit about how nonverbal communication defines and regulates relationships. So on the left-hand side, you see a photo of two people at work. So I want you, before I tell you, to guess who's the employee and who's the boss. They both have on suits, right? So what tells you? So part of what's telling you is something called proxemics. It's the way that they're positioned. So the boss is standing over the employee. You very rarely see an employee going like that and looking over the shoulder of a boss, right? Because part of the definition of relationship is that the boss has more power and has permission to invade your space to a certain extent, right? Not too extreme, but they can do that, right? And whereas you would never do that with your boss. And then another way to define your relationship is through closeness and how close you stand, whether you touch, hold hands, things like that, that defines intimacy, right? And we stand more distant from our friends and even more distant from our bosses or our teachers or people that we're not close to, right? So that is in part defining it, how close we stand and what kinds of, whether there's touching allowed or not touching, right? That's regulating and defining the relationship. And then nonverbal communication creates interaction climates. So this is a combination of all of the different aspects of nonverbal communication. So that 1950s photo I showed you of college students, right? The interaction climate looks very stiff and formal. It doesn't look like you're invited to participate. It doesn't look like the professor even wants you to talk, right? Maybe you're allowed to raise your hand. I'm not sure. But it looks like this is a situation where students, they're just going to listen while the teacher imparts knowledge and not really say anything and just take notes. Whereas on the right-hand side, that's a photograph of a large communication class where students are interacting. And it's very common if you're in the classroom that in communication classes, you go into groups and you're given discussion prompts and you have interactions. So it's a much more casual, informal, and more open kind of environment for interacting. So that's what we call climate. Is it friendly? Is it formal? Is it informal? Is it intimate? Is it hostile, right? Is it jovial? All of these things. It's how you feel. Climate is like the feeling that's generated in the space. And some of it has to do with the way you arrange the space, and some of it has to do with the way people interact and what kind of rules there are about how to interact. So you see, instead of being in rows in that classroom on the right, they have tables and they're sitting in circular format, which it creates an egalitarian kind of structure for everybody to talk to each other in an equal kind of way versus in the rows where it's very formal and you only speak to the person speaking if you're given permission to do that. Now, moving on from the functions of nonverbal communication to the components, we have several aspects of communication that exist besides words, and these include gestures, body language, how we utter the words, the features of the environment that we're in. We create our environment, so we really are expressing aspects of ourselves by the way that we create our environments. And then the objects that we have and the objects that we use, all of that expresses meaning. The four features of nonverbal communication are, the first is that it's ambiguous. So words can mean different things to different people, and words can actually be used strategically to be ambiguous so that you can deny that something means what what you think it means, right? Or with a gesture or a facial expression, right? Then you have the fact that it interacts with the verbal communication. So there were some researchers like Morabian who tried to determine a percentage of the meaning that comes from just the nonverbal communication. And many scholars think that's actually pretty hard to determine when the nonverbal communication is happening at the same time as the verbal. So if a person is making a facial expression while they're talking, you're still listening to the words and you're getting meaning from the words as well as from the nonverbal. When there's a problem is when the nonverbal doesn't match the verbal. And I'm sure you've all experienced this one where you look at someone and they have a scowl on their face and you ask them, well, why are you angry? And then they'll say, I'm not angry, right? But you can tell they're angry by their facial expression. And then actually their voice also expresses it, but not the words. The tone of voice is what expresses it, right? And another feature of nonverbal communication is that it regulates interaction. And then the last is that it reflects our cultural values. So I'll be saying a little more about all of these aspects or features of nonverbal communication. Looking at this picture of the Mona Lisa, look at her facial expression and tell me what she's thinking. And if you think you know what you're thinking, then you must be smarter than all the people who have been trying to figure out for centuries, what is she thinking? And one of the reasons this picture is so famous is because people can't figure out what she's thinking and what Da Vinci meant by that expression, because it's almost a smile, but not quite in a smile. Yeah. So the ambiguity is a feature of nonverbal communication, even more so than verbal communication. And so it makes it more difficult to read. There are people who claim that they can very accurately read nonverbal communication, but there's always caveats to that, right? When they give people lie detector tests, they are measuring the sweat that's coming out of their bodies. Well, they could be sweating simply because they're nervous about being a suspect and not simply because they're actually guilty, right? So it's one kind of nonverbal communication to be exuding sweat, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that you're guilty. It could mean, or that you're lying. It could just mean that you're feeling very nervous about the fact that you're being interrogated. So ambiguity is a feature. Sometimes people smile not because they're happy, but because they're nervous. Sometimes people smile because they're uncomfortable. Sometimes people smile to cover another feeling because they don't feel like having a conflict, right? So we can never be 100% certain about what nonverbal communication means, but we do have some common kinds of gestures, facial expressions, so on, that we will see that people will label in particular ways, like a smile being equated with happiness and a frown being equated with sadness. The next feature we're going to talk about is how it expresses relationship qualities. So here's another picture that I want you to take a look at and think about who are the employees and who's the boss in the situation. How do these people feel about each other? Do they like each other? Do they not like each other? And are they being responsive, right? So it's interesting to do this in a class and actually hear people respond because there are some different interpretations of it. But the way I look at it is that the man is the boss because he is coming up and putting his arm onto the shoulder of an employee. And then the way that he's looking over the work, it's like the two people are working and then he's like giving an opinion of it, right? And so it expresses that there is responsiveness. They're really listening to each other. There's also liking that's going on. And then there could be a power dynamic there as well, the man having more power. However, I've had students interpret as this is a real estate agent showing the some information about a property that the couple's interested in, and that the man is the husband of the woman who is the wife, and they have a close relationship, and that's why he has his hand on her, and they are appreciative of the real estate agent as they're sitting kind of close and everybody seems really comfortable. So either one of those interpretations could be correct, right? And that's the thing about nonverbal. It's a little bit ambiguous, but it also does define relationships or express them, express responsiveness, liking, and power in relationships. Now we're going to go into the types of nonverbal communication. So there are 10 types of nonverbal communication, and each of them is used to create and interpret meanings. The first is called kinesics. Kinesics refers to the body position and body motions, and these include those of the face as well as, the arms, legs, the torso, and so on. Body postures and gestures may signal whether we are open to interaction. So if you're at a party and somebody is moving towards you and then you turn away from them, that person gets the impression like you don't want to talk to them. And so that's just an example of how your posture and so on and your gestures. The face is a particularly powerful nonverbal communicator, and it conveys liking and responsiveness, and smiling in particular, frowning, and so on. And people react pretty strongly to our facial expressions. And so people react really strongly to our facial expressions. Now, I'm asked you to watch a video this week by Amy Cuddy that shows you how nonverbal communication operates and also how you can generate feelings through your nonverbal communication. So you don't just express them. Her argument is that you can also generate feelings by your nonverbal communication. So Amy Cuddy says that this is a power pose, which is characterized by fill in the blank, openness. So if you have your body more open, then you're seen as being more powerful and more confident. Haptics. So haptics is the study of touch, and nonverbal communication involving physical touch can be very, very powerful. Compared to men, women are much more likely to engage in touch than men are, and they're much more likely to show their liking and intimacy than men are, with the exception of when men are in intimate relationships, right? So women are more comfortable touching each other as friends and also touching men even if they're not their friends. If they are their friends, but not their boyfriends or their husbands. And men are more likely um, than women to use touch to assert power and control. So we see in the photograph here, we see a doctor putting his hand on the shoulder of a patient, and it's most likely meant to show that he cares and that he likes them, but it also shows power because you're not going to see the patient going out and putting their hand on the doctor. It's very rarely done. So that's what we mean by saying that it can show power. Like who touches who will give us information about the power in the relationship. So that's haptics, the touch factors of communication. And then we have physical appearance, okay? So Western culture places an extremely high value on sex, skin color, and size, and it can have no factual basis, but it can have an effect on your personal and social relationships and also decisions about hiring, placement, and promotion. And then last, the culture prescribes ideals, and these do vary from culture to culture. Western ideals emphasize thinness in women and muscularity and height in men. So I got this picture specifically because Lizzo is trying to change these biases in our culture and show body positivity and that you can feel good and be attractive when you're not the idealized thinness of women, right? That there are different shapes that are acceptable and so on. And so this is a positive aspect of culture today, that these stereotypes and these restrictions are starting to change and people are feeling more comfortable about who they are, no matter what their size or shape and so on. But in our culture, there has been a real bias around it. And sadly, it does affect things like who people want to date, who they want to hire, and so on. I saw a really interesting 60 Minutes episode where a person who worked for the 60 Minutes company went in and interviewed for a job, and she was thin. So she was hired. She went to the same job interview in a fat suit and disguising her face somewhat and putting a wig on so they wouldn't know who she was. And she wasn't given the job. So it was the same job, same interviewers. And just because she was fat, she was turned down, where when she was skinny, she was actually given the job. So that's an example, but I think a lot of people can tell you that these kind of biases do operate, even though I'm very happy to say that these are changing, but it's a slow and steady process of social change. We need to be changing this even faster. Olfactics is smell, right? So people can perceive odors and scents, and it's a part of how we communicate who we are. Like some people like to have a special scent that they wear as part of their identity, and there's also there's also biological evidence that our pheromones affect sexual attraction. I don't know anyone that's dated somebody simply because of their smell, but perhaps it's just a factor that's there, whether or not we're attracted to someone. And there has been some controversy around this because there are people that have very severe allergies to perfumes and colognes and things like that. And so I've been to a lot of places where they will ask you to not wear those scents because people can be negatively affected by them in that space. So that's just something to be aware of in the places where you interact, or could the scent that you're wearing give someone an allergic reaction? Like you probably wouldn't want that, right? Okay, so olfactics also influences, and it's a way that we can express meaning, and then people are going to interpret those meanings about us. Artifacts are a lot of different things. They can include any objects that we use that announce our identities and also that we use to personalize our environment. So clothing is the most common form of artifact, and we have all different kinds of clothes that we wear, and people in different cultures wear different kinds of clothes. And it can announce your profession, it can announce your hobby, it can announce your political perspective, and there's so many things that can get expressed by our artifacts and our clothing. People could wear a cross, the Star of David. They could wear prayer beads to express their spirituality. This picture is a woman from a culture that puts these rings in to stretch the neck, and then over the years, what actually happens is that the neck doesn't stretch, but that the shoulder and the torso gets pushed down, 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 so that it looks like the neck is lengthened, and that's considered to be more beautiful in that culture. So artifacts vary. They can be very, very different. And when we're from a different culture, they may be hard to understand and not seem like they're preferable the way they would to somebody else in that culture. Here's some examples of how your artifacts can identify your profession. You can tell by this photo who the doctor is and who the nurse is, right? Because the doctors are the ones that wear the white coats and the nurses wear the scrubs. And then you can, of course, tell who the patient is because they have to wear those kinds of clothes that patients wear, right? Where you just tie them up in the back. So they identify your profession and also when you're a client and so on. The next area we're going to look at is proxemics, and this refers to the use of space and how we use it. The use of space can influence how we feel about people, and it expresses what we think is what the relationship is, right? So status, culture, and then our interaction needs, our interdependency. So how dependent are we on other people and so on, and power relationships, they're all influenced and they're all expressed through proxemics. And this is a chart of what's considered to be intimate space versus personal space versus social space versus public space. So you see the people that are intimate in the middle, and they're actually even holding hands because they can stand very, very close to each other. And then you have personal space where you keep your distance a little bit, like around 3 feet, 3 to 5 feet, and then social space, usually 5 feet. So you'll notice, like, if you're getting on a bus and there's no one on the bus and you sit down, the next person that comes in is probably not going to sit right next to you. Since the bus is empty, they'll probably sit a few seats away from you because it's social space and they want to not be close to you because they don't know you. But if you got on the bus with your friend, you would probably sit right next to them instead, right? Or in adjoining seats and look at each other. And then public space, people will spread out even more. Like if you go to the beach and there's not a lot of people there and somebody's got their blanket down, you're probably not going to stick your blanket right next to them. You'll probably be 20, 30 feet away, right? But then as the beach fills up and there's hardly any space left near the water, then the blankets start getting closer and closer together. So with public space, we will take more space when we can, but we will shorten that space when we have to so that we can fit into the space where we want to be. And this is what's typical in the United States. So for intimates, they could be 1.5 feet away, but if it's personal, friends, it's 3 to 4 feet away. And then social space, people will stay 12 feet away. So in a classroom, and or not in a classroom, but like at a party. And then in public, people will start out like trying to leave at least 25 feet away from another person. And then, as I said, if it gets crowded, then they'll start getting closer together and so on. Okay. The same thing with social space, right? If you're at a party and it gets really crowded, then then everybody might be standing in the personal space zone, right? 3 to 5 feet or even less right next to each other because it's so crowded and you can't get in the kitchen to get a drink, right? Okay, so that's how that's proxemics, the way space is used. Okay. Then you have environmental factors. And so the way we set up an environment is an expression of how we feel, how we think, our identities, how much we have in the way of resources, how much money we have, what kind of materials do we have, all these kinds of things go into how we arrange our spaces. And different organizations arrange their space differently to give off different feelings. I don't know if any of you have visited CAPS lately, but I went there on a tour last week, and it was really great here on campus with our psychological services, and they have peer services as well as professional counselors. But they've created a space where students can just go in to relax, and they have this nap. There's something called, I forget, it's a pod. That's what it is. It's a pod for napping and it closes you off, but they're just creating a more relaxed and chill atmosphere down there so that students could have a place to get away from the stressfulness of classes. Yeah. So that's an example of how the psychology program that we have, the CAPS program, is trying to help students to de-stress by changing the way the space is. And this is an example of on here of somebody who may be a student and doesn't have a lot of money, maybe working class, and so the way that their space is decorated, it doesn't cost a lot of money to decorate your space that way. And it looks like they even have like a mattress on the floor for a bed, right? So that's expresses your class status, the way you arrange your space, or it can. And then you have the fact that we take for granted the way our spaces are, and we don't even think about how privileged we are. So if you think about United States, we have public schools and we even have public colleges, and we take it for granted that we have tables and chairs and computers and all this equipment to have classes, right? On the right, you see a class in Africa where it's a village that doesn't have resources, and kids are just sitting outside, and you have kids of different ages because there's just one class for everybody, and they're sitting outside, and they just have a board there and a teacher to try to teach all the students of the different ages, right? So we take for granted what we have in the United States. It's incredible where, you can you could be born in another country, and through the accident of birth you would never get to go to school, or you would have to go like this. I've seen pictures of school in India where they're sitting on the ground and the teacher's drawing with the stick in the dirt because they don't have any resources. Here's an example of, where you're getting more upscale from that first picture I show you that looked like a starving student bedroom to a more middle class one on the left. Okay, and then you got somebody that's got even more resources on the right, and you have a very, very fancy. So look how much larger it is. Look how it's open. Look at the brand new shiny furniture that's in there, and the kind of shiny objects, the stools, and that kind of island that's there in the kitchen. That's just a huge amount of space, right? And so some people are very privileged and have a ton of space, and then they can express that in, how they're setting up that space. And versus, when you have more modest means, and your space is going to look a little bit different, right? That couch on the left looks a bit more worn than that leather couch on the right, and so on. Okay, so your environment does communicate a lot about your station in life, your values, the pictures you put up, the objects. Some people put up lots of pictures of their family. Some people put up abstract art, some people put up posters, and so on. There's so many different ways that we can express ourselves today, and we are telling people about our identities and the way that we set up our space. And then offices do the same thing, buildings do the same thing, neighborhoods do the same thing, and so on. It's all kinds of aspects of values and culture and identities that gets expressed in how space is in our environments. Okay. Now, another factor is, or component, is chronemics. And chronemics is how we perceive and use time. And that differs from culture to culture. So Western societies value time and speed. We have an expression, time is money. And the expectations of time are influenced by your social norms. And some people that come here from other cultures that don't have such a strong value on punctuality and on time being so valuable and time potentially being wasted, they have different approaches to it, and it can be sort of stressful to come here and have this put on you. Um, Now, this anthropologist, Richard Lewis, talked about the linear concept of time. So Western time is very much linear. We have past, present, and future. We tend to orient towards the future. And then our flow of time is like the past is over. We don't need to think about it anymore. And then the present, we're just trying to line up what we're supposed to be doing. And then for the future, we start planning ahead, right? We put it in our calendars, and we want to do this because we need predictability and control, and because we're organized around these workplaces where people are interdependent and have to rely on other people. So if people aren't there, um, it's hard to get your job done right. So that's very much of the Western flow of time. And we have this expression, like I said, that time is money. So in the US, you have to make money, otherwise you're a nobody. And if you have 40 years of earning capacity and you want to make 4 million, that means 100,000 per annum. If you can achieve this in 250 work days, that comes to $400 a day or $50 an hour. With this orientation, Americans can say that their time costs $50 an hour. So Americans talk about wasting time, spending time, budgeting time, and saving time. And they have a similar view of time in Germany, Switzerland, England, and Scandinavian countries. So, in short, that's an Anglo-Saxon view of time that's very much connected to capitalism. Okay, now in Asia, if they have a different view of time, and so this is on the top US linear time going, A, B, C, D to E, F, right? So 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Whereas in Asian time, there's more of a view of it as being cyclical instead of being linear. So the past is important, the present's important, and the future, but you could like kind of look at it as a whole instead of being so focused always on just getting to the future. And the same is true of a lot of Native American communities. They don't think about time as being linear, but as being more holistic, and that the past is really important. And they really they revere their ancestors more than we do here. And also, they think that the future is important, so they think that we need to take care of the planet because of the future generations. All right, so that's a little bit. Now, in Spain, they also have linear time, but look at how much bigger the lunch break is in theory. Okay, so like from supposedly lunch is from like 12 to to 2, it looks like, right? But in actuality, the lunch overlaps, so it starts before that and goes after, and they're just a lot more relaxed, and they're not as worried about punctuality and punching into time clocks and so on. I recently had a friend that like spent a year in Spain and said it was just so laid back that she felt like it was just too laid back for her because she's used to our way of dealing with time. So it's all cultural, how you experience time and how you think about it. But the important thing is to understand how the people that you want to interact with, you have to think about how they view time because it can create conflict when you have, say, a Spanish view of time, but you're working in an American company that has stricter hours and a stricter way of dealing with your breaks and so on. And then, you find yourself in trouble. Or if you're an American and you go work in Spain and they're going to view you as being uptight because you're always so worried about being punctual, and they think that, take it easy, just relax, it's okay. So that's the thing. When you have across different cultures, it can be a problem. But we have in the United States many, many different cultures interacting. Our workplaces typically try to enforce a Western view of time, but sometimes people from other cultures have a hard time adapting to that. And so, if you're a person in a position of authority, you might want to help people understand it instead of just penalizing them because they're not punctual, but try to help them understand why we do it. Okay. Now, if you want to learn more, these are two really good websites that talk about time and culture, and it is seen as really important if you're going to work across different cultures. It's very, very important. Okay, now we're moving into paralanguage. So paralanguage is communication that's not the actual words, but it does include the sounds and the murmurs. So if I say, ah, yeah, okay. So these kinds of things, we make noises when we're talking to people or when we're listening to people that aren't actual words, but people are interpreting it. And we are trying to express meaning with those kinds of sounds. So that's called paralanguage. Also, the inflection in your voice, the way that you talk, it communicates different kinds of feelings. And I have a video of Prince O, and and I am going to just have it on our website for you to watch to see how he uses um, his voice and creates rhythm and so on, and makes very, very good use of paralanguage to get his ideas across. So you're going to have that video to watch. The last type of nonverbal communication we're looking at here is silence. And silence is the lack of communicated sound. It can communicate a powerful message. It can also communicate contentment, but it can also communicate awkwardness. So this really depends on what you're used to. And in the United States, we're used to people talking a lot and having a steady stream of talk when people get together. In other cultures, people are comfortable with silence. And so when friends get together, they don't have to be talking the whole time, they could be silent. One of my colleagues went to Finland, and the Finns are sometimes called the silent Finns because they're very comfortable with silence. So when he went and met the president of the university because he was invited to be a Fulbright scholar for a year, and he went there, and he met the president, he said, "Hi, how you doing? Wow, love your campus, beautiful town." He was just going on and on and on and on and on, and the president of the university was just staring at him. And then he said, "Uh-huh." And then that made the American made him nervous. So then he started talking even more. So the quieter the Finnish president was, the president of the university, the more talkative the American professor got. And he realized afterwards that what was going on was that the Finnish culture is silent, and that they didn't need to talk, and that he was just trying to fill in all the space with lots and lots of talk. So he asked the president if he could reenact their meeting when they first got together and put it onto a video. So I got to see that video, and it was very entertaining. He also said later that when he went to visit people, it was common to like sit down, sit in the living room and hang out, and someone would say something, and then nobody would talk for 20 minutes at a time. And it was really hard for him at first, and then he just tried to just do what the other people were doing, so he would just stay silent. And he said in the beginning it was just so hard because we're used to thinking in the United States when you're around people, we're talking. We're not going to be silent, right? So it's interesting how it's silent. Now, people can also give you the silent treatment. So they would do that when they're mad, right? They stop talking to you. And so then we see that, that something's wrong with the relationship, and then we will either try to fix it, repair it, or we won't, depending on how we feel about the relationship, right? But it can be very, very powerful. And in speeches, when people are talking and they pause for a longer time than usual, like people will really stop and notice. And that's why it's done. It's called a dramatic pause to get people to stop and think. So silence also communicates. It's ambiguous. So we've tried to fill in the blanks, but it's another way of communicating. Now we're moving into the digital and nonverbal communication information that I have here. So nonverbal communication in digital media is more restricted, right? We don't see people, we can't see their bodies, their posture, their facial expression, we can't see the environment they're in. So people have felt a need to try to create a replacement for some of that. So we have emoticons or stickers that are ways to show emotion. And so it's like it's nonverbal because they're not, the icons or the emoticons are not words, but they're replacements for the live facial expressions. And people will use them differently, so they're creating a unique way of expressing themselves, and we call that the digital footprint. And then digital communication can sometimes compete with the face-to-face communication. So if you're talking to somebody and then they keep staring at their phone, right? It's taking away they're taking attention away from you, and it can be really frustrating. So be careful about that when you're interacting with people, that if you keep looking down at your phone, people are going to get a message from you that you're not interested in what they have to say. So if that's not what you intend, you need to think about that, right? Now, to communicate more effectively, non-verbally, what you need to do is to start paying attention, right? So we call that monitoring. You have to monitor your nonverbal communication and start becoming aware of what it is that you're doing. A lot of our nonverbal behaviors are done out of our awareness. We don't even realize we're doing it. And it's good to ask people that you're close to for feedback about what they see you doing so that you can try to get to know yourself better and see what you're doing. The important thing is that whatever it is you're doing, that you want to be understood, you want to be interpreted the way that you intend. So you want to know if your nonverbal communication matches your verbal communication and if it fits. So you can get feedback on that from people that you're close to. It's really important to realize that because nonverbal communication is ambiguous, that you need to think about the fact that there could be another interpretation. So when we say personal qualifications, you want to be thinking about it and verifying it before you assume that it's a fact, right? So think about what's going on with that person, the personal qualifications. And then for the contextual qualifications, think about what's happening in the environment and if that, whatever you're interpreting, fits in that particular environment. Okay, so um, those are the guidelines for effective communication. In sum, what we talked about is that there's 5 functions of nonverbal communication. We have seen the 4 features of nonverbal communication. We've also seen 10 different kinds of nonverbal communication, and we've looked at a couple of guidelines for nonverbal communication that can help you effectively communicate with you what you intend, right? And I'm just going to repeat those. So monitor yourself, try to become aware, get feedback if you need to know. And then when you're interpreting it, make sure that you really understand where the person's coming from and what's going on. That's making the personal qualifications, and then also the environment, like what's happening in the environment that could be influencing this and influencing both what the person's communicating nonverbally and what they're communicating, and what you're interpreting from that. Okay. All right. Well, I hope that you appreciate this information and can use it to your advantage. Take care.